The show must go on, Marketplace of Ideas podcast listeners, but it will only go on if it reaches 10,000 podcast subscribers in 2011. You can do your part by writing about the show on your blog, or blogging about it, as they say, tweeting about it, or reviewing it on iTunes. You can go to iTunes, search for the Marketplace of Ideas, and the page in the iTunes directory will give you a space to give a star rating and a review, and thus raise its profile just a little bit, but that could be enough to put it over the Malcolm Gladwell type tipping point to 10,000 subscribers in 2011, which is, let me remind you, the only way the Marketplace of Ideas will continue. Thank you. This week it's a conversation with poet, professor of English, and scholar of Charlie Chan, Yunte Huang, on the Marketplace of Ideas, cultural conversation at the depth you demand. It's the Marketplace of Ideas. I am your man of letters and sound waves, Colin Marshall, here today with Yunte Huang, poet and professor of English at the University of California, Santa Barbara, right where we broadcast from, and the author of a new book, Charlie Chan, The Untold Story of the Honorable Detective and His Rendezvous with American History. Yunte, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
There is a lot of discussion, of course, of Charlie Chan's movies in this book, but there's also, toward the end, a discussion of one of my very favorite movies, which is not a Charlie Chan movie, but it is a Chan movie. It's Wayne Wang's Chan is Missing. Right. And it's the story, for people who haven't seen it, of these two amateur detectives they become in San Francisco's Chinatown in the early 80s, searching for a missing man who's absconded with their money, and they talk to many members of the Asian American community, an Asian community there, and they ask, where's Chan? And they all give him different answers as far as who Chan is. Chan seems like a different person to everybody. And here there's a lot of Charlie Chans in your book, the Charlie Chan of the books, of the films, of the cartoons even. Is this one unified single Charlie Chan to you, or is this a lot of Charlie Chans?
Well, I'm glad you started out by mentioning Chan is Missing. This is one of my favorite Chan films too. I think this is really the best. I think Wayne Wang's Chan is Missing is really the best kind of Asian American spoof or kind of counter-mockery in some sense, or remake or reinterpretation of the whole Charlie Chan legacy in the United States. And like you said, what's great about this film, and it's a low-budget kind of independent film, is that they constantly search for Charlie Chan, but of course there's no answer, and eventually one of the characters said, if you guys are looking for Mr. Chan, you should look in the puddle, because there you see your own image. So my book, in a sense, it's also kind of a search for Charlie Chan, who he really is. Or to quote Charlie Chan, truth is like football, receive many kicks before reaching goal. And I had to give this kind of football truth many kicks in order to find him, who he really is. So, if since you have read many of the reviews out there, and you have read the book too, and you wrote a review yourself, and thank you for that. The book is not a straightforward narrative because there's no one Charlie Chan we can describe. There's the real Charlie Chan, Chang Apana, this great Honolulu detective, and there's Earl Biggers himself, the creator of Charlie Chan, who interestingly resembles, in his, if you look at his portrait, he actually looks like the, on-screen character Charlie Chan. So in a way, it's kind of autobiography even. And there's, of course, the fictional Charlie Chan, and there's the Chinese Charlie Chan too, in a sense that in China, Charlie Chan films were also being made in the 1930s and 40s.
And there's something in Charlie Chan that outlives everything else. He outlives E.D. Biggers, he outlives Chang Apana, he outlives the production of Charlie Chan movies. Would you say there's some?
And
Charlie
he
Chan
even outlives, the death knell, which was sounded in the 1980s and 90s, that Charlie Chan is dead.
Right, titles of famous anthologies.
Exactly,
right? Yeah.
Yes. Uh-huh.
It's interesting to see what Charlie Chan is now, because the concept of Charlie Chan has survived all this. What remains at the end of all these deaths of Charlie Chan that have kept happening?
Well, it's Charlie Chan. To put in a nutshell, really, Charlie Chan to me is this embodiment of both the the racist legacy of American culture, but also the creative genius of this culture. So in a sense, it's, Charlie Chang will live on as long as American culture, its kind of ingenuity, creativity lives on. So, one of the reviews, since there are way too many reviews, only remember the bad ones.
Yes,
that's the disadvantage. But there are, but occasionally you do remember the good ones. And in this, Richard Bernstein, who wrote this great review in the New York Review of Books, in which he concludes by saying, the last paragraph, saying, to know Charlie Chang is to know ourselves. And because Charlie Chang really embodies what's great, but also what's problematic about American culture.
You mentioned all these reviews, and certainly the book's gotten so much press. How did you know, I should say, this was a time to maybe rehabilitate Charlie Chan's image, or to bring scholarly eyes back to Charlie Chan?
Well, no one can really predict or plan that, because, you just want to write a book, and it seems like the book came out at the right moment, maybe. And you can only know it in retrospect, And I do think this is a great moment to re-examine the Charlie Chang, legacy, the iconic Chinaman, but also the book comes out at a time when China and the U.S. relationship is also changing because of the so-called rise of China. And there is kind of sense of, yellow peril. Not yellow peril, if you look at the election this year and talking about China, loss of jobs, et cetera, now the G20 meeting, in Seoul, everything, it's kind of the geopolitics. It's also, lies in the background too.
Right. You read about how Charlie Chan arose out of a time in the 1920s when you wouldn't expect a Chinese character to take hold in the U.S. And is it a comparable time in that sense? How even now you wouldn't expect necessarily people to be thinking about this old Chinese character, and yet it seems they have, reading your book.
Right. So that's why the character is really kind of give us a kind of a sobering moment to rethink, look at what happened, for instance, in the 1920s, just to give our listeners a little bit background, that 1920s is not just the so-called jazz age when flappers were dancing really fast as they could, but it's also one of the most xenophobic eras in the United States because, the year before Charlie Chang was born, the character, the U.S. passed the 1924 Johnson-Reed Act. After the 1882 anti-immigration bill. This is, this 1924 bill was really a landmark anti-immigration legislation, which effectively bans immigration coming from Southern Europe, Eastern Europe, Irish, Ireland, and all Asians were banned. And this is the moment when Charlie Chang, this lovable, funny, wisecracking Chinaman, stumbling on the stage. There are many explanations of that. One explanation is really, despite the kind of xenophobia, America always had this kind of love, a fondness for the exotic, the Orient, so-called. But there's another explanation, which is the 1920s was also the golden age of Anglo-American mystery, novels. The genre was born in that period. You can think about Hercule Poirot, another kind of funny, almost kind of characterized, foreigner, was a great detective, exactly. So it's an interesting moment.
You write about in the book how you originally came upon Charlie Chan at an estate sale, I believe. And I want to know, having relatively recently come to America when you found those, what was your reaction to seeing this old American caricature of a Chinese man as it was thought of, as he was conceived?
Right. Well, I found these books, like you said, at an estate sale in Buffalo, and Buffalo was becoming a ghost town, due to various reasons, economic and weather and everything. And I was a graduate student there, and I found these two books at $1 each at an estate sale, and I was hooked right away. There's one reason, because that was also the time, not just, a year after Charlie Chang was announced dead, right?
Right, yes.
But also, I was working on, Ezra Pound's Amy Lowell's Imagism. And Imagism, for those of you who don't know, is a kind of school of modern American poetry that imitates, Asian aesthetics, or especially Chinese language, for instance. And Charlie Chang is another kind of imitation, or you can say mockery, or parody of Chinese language. So we are talking about American culture high and low high in the sense of modernist poets, but also low in the popular, imagination. They both had the fascination of what a Chinese looks like and how they talk, etc., etc. So as an outsider coming in, I was like, wow, this is really interesting, Yeah.
But you didn't think to yourself, like so many think, look at this horrible racist caricature?
No, if you read the novels, he's a really lovable character, really. And of course, the most astonishing thing when I first discovered the novels was that I realized there was a real Charlie Chang, Chang Apana, and he was somehow forgotten in history. And so that's why I went on to do more research. And
Right, you do follow his trail, Chang Apana's trail, the real inspiration for Charlie Chan. And what's interesting about the book is that you don't make it a super clear transition from Chang Apana into Charlie Chan, the fictional character, because there are parts where it's complicated, of course. And you can tell us that Chang Apana was pretty different. I mean, he couldn't read, but he was very skinny, not like the big Charlie Chan we know. And he maybe didn't speak in those same aphorisms, but he was good with a bullwhip. Right. The points of, it seems like there's as many points of convergence as there are divergence with the real Charlie Chan quotes and the fictional one. Right. Is that the case?
Yes, it's the whole case is as complicated as a Charlie Chang mystery in some sense. So there's no black and white interpretation of some of these things. And if, for instance, if the later Asian Americans were kind of offended by the Charlie Chang caricature, Chang Apana, for instance, himself, he loved, all this, characterization of him in a sense, and he will come to the, on-site production, the set, and he was laughing his head off with Warner Oland's imitation of him. So what does it say about Charlie Chan, really?
And we have this character, we've described what he's like in the books, and of course you mentioned Warner Oland playing him in the movies as a Swedish man, really, of course, and that's something that just seems ridiculous today looking back on, that you would hire a Swedish man to play a Chinese man, but this was the time. And I want to get an idea of, you talk about Chang Apana's amusement with this character, you talk about your own. Are the objections to Charlie Chan mainly coming from the Asian American community rather than perhaps people who were born in Asia and came over here, or people who are still in Asia?
I think that the issue is not really, just Asian Americans, because I think it's that's why in the book I write about this crucial period when Charlie Chan's image was tarnished. I think that was the post-World War II decades after, remember the last Charlie Chan film, The Sky Dragon, starring Roland Winters, another white actor doing Charlie Chan. When that film was going around the country in the summer of 1949, that's exactly the moment when America was, mourning the loss of China, so-called. That was the end of Chinese Civil War, when Mao's communists, defeated the nationalists who were unwisely supported by Americans. Right. And so when Mao announced, on Tiananmen Square on October 1st, 1949, that this is the founding of People's Republic of China, from the American perspective, it was as if the whole continent of Asia was being swallowed up in a sea of redness. And there was the Korean War, yes. And President Obama is, in Korea today. But so it is in that 50s, in that kind of Cold War propaganda, but also anti-Chinese, anti-communist paranoia, what I call the C word. And remember, Charlie Chan is double C. Mm-hmm. And in that, environment, everything Chinese, almost everything Chinese, I should say, picked up these kind of negative, insidious connotations. And for Charlie, and that's the period when Charlie Chan became most popular in the post-war, on the film screens and on TV, is that a lot of, baby boomers grew up in that funny Chinaman image. It is in that environment, kind of poisoned air, when Charlie Chan continued to wisecrack. And remember, if you're Asian American at the time, you understand, you experience that racism, targeting you. If you're growing up Asian, you have neighborhood kids coming to you, doing Charlie Chang imitation to you, calling you a Jap, whereas in fact you're Chinese or Korean.
Right.
And so while Charlie Chang was cracking jokes on the screen, so you're going to hate that. So that's Asian American. On the other hand, a lot of people who are more sensitive to the racist legacy of America might also kind of look at Charlie Chang as a negative stereotype. To me, I'm not trying to, argue that he's a good character or anything. I think it's a lot more complicated, than a black-white, interpretation.
We mentioned E.D. Biggers, who wrote the original Charlie Chan novels and created this character as a minor character first, who then was kind of a popular demand, brought him out forward. And it's something that I'm not too clear about even now, but E.D. Biggers, in the quotes from him you put in the book, he expresses surprise that he says, well, I don't know anything about China or Chinese people, yet you like my Chinese character. What do we know about how he was able to craft a Chinese character, this guy from Ohio who went to Harvard? I mean, what was his experience that let him do this?
Exactly. I mean, that's one of the Charlie Chang mysteries I was trying to solve in the book, is how, like you put it, a young boy, growing up in a small town in Ohio was able to craft this kind of Chinaman image. He's really the opposite of, say, Sax Rohmer, the creator of Dr. Fu Manchu. And Rohmer made this kind of infamous statement, that he said, I made my name on Fu Manchu because I know nothing about the Chinese. E.D. Biggers is not the case. It's the opposite. He did a lot of study, research. If you read the novels, the 6 novels that, he published before he died at the age of 48, he was well-read in Asian American history, the immigration, railroad building, Chinese by Chinese, and all these other, the presence of Chinese or Asian American in the West or in the United States. He did a lot of research. He did his homework. But also, the fact that he went to Harvard and living in Boston was also important, because Boston was really the hotbed of Orientalism in, late 19th century and early 20th century. If you think about the so-called Boston Brahmins, including Lafcadio Hearn, Ernest Fenollosa, even Henry Adams and his friend John Lafarge, people who went to Japan and China and brought back, East Asian art, literature, and aesthetics, teapots and everything. Think about that. He was living really in the hotbed of Orientalism.
So when there's like the letter in the book where he writes from Charlie Chan's perspective and he alludes to the fact that he, E.D. Biggers, knows nothing of China. That was maybe him just being modest about it?
Yeah, he was being playful. Yeah, definitely. If you read the novels, you will know he's really well read in all these fields. Even the same with, Warner Oland, the Swedish actor. He studied Chinese language. These people, that's why I should say, the character was created in a very racist environment. Despite that, we can also think about, say, blackface or redface or Jewface. Despite all the racism, there is this kind of, creative genius that was, evident in all these novels and the films.
Some people hold up Charlie Chan as the Asian equivalent of blackface, like you mentioned. It sounds like, from your perspective, he's not exactly the equivalent of that, right? I mean, he's a little more nuanced than a blackface character would be, right?
Well, there's no doubt that's yellowface. There's a white actor playing, Asian character. But I think I just want to create a more nuanced reading or interpretation, rather than say, all these cases of racial ventriloquism. You can also talk about, Daniel Day-Lewis playing, Last Mohican. It's the same thing. It's the playing Indian, so-called. And look, this is really something, as a cultural historian, a literary scholar of, in America, and also coming from the outside as an immigrant, this is really something uniquely American, is this, case of racial ventriloquism. We cannot imagine, the beauty or the aesthetics of blues or jazz without that kind of, infamous history of slavery. It's impossible. But this does not mean we should celebrate racism because of racism. Therefore, there's the sadness, the beauty of music or literature. That's the fact. But that doesn't mean, we have to thank racism for that. It's just something we have to acknowledge rather than say, this is really bad because it's created out of the, toxic soil racism. Therefore, we have to ban it. And I think, this unfortunate thing that took place with the character Charlie Chang the past 20 or 30 years, to me is somewhat unfortunate because it has something to do, like I said, with the 1950s and 60s kind of the tarnishing of Charlie Chang's image in that poisoned environment.
Could we say then that the idea here is to acknowledge racist contexts, but still recognize that we have the things that came out of them and we can find value in them? It's too bad they had to come out of racism, but we can still find something worthwhile in that. Not in the racism, but in the products of a time that happened to be racist?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, we have to acknowledge their past. And I'm not saying now it's okay to come out of the closet and enjoy Charlie Chang with still a little kind of, some guilty pleasure. It's not really about that. It is really about to look at this character, or ultimately, I want to with this book, I want to kind of reopen the debate or conversation over race and culture in American literature or American culture, really, because oftentimes we have a great democracy here, but somehow despite there's a lot of racism out there in the media, but somehow we cannot sit down and talk about it in a civil or in a interesting or intellectually engaging way. So either without like just shouting and yelling or staying angry quietly. That's usually the two extremes. And so I think the same thing happened with Charlie Chang. Either it's great that he's a hero, or he's just a racist characterization. Therefore, he should be banned. And these two extremes, I think, are equally problematic.
As we mentioned, you came across the Charlie Chan books in the Buffalo Estate sale quite a while ago, but then you get to this point and you've got this book about Charlie Chan. What kept you interested enough in the character to do so much research and to make it into such a large scholarly effort? I mean, it's one thing to be a fan of the books, but it's another thing to put this much effort into it. Right.
Well, once again, it's like, how shall we say it? Charlie Chang as a character, I mean, this topic, the novels and the films have been really a hobby of mine, like you said, for over like 15 or 16 years. And I never thought of writing a book about him. There's something you like it's like collecting stamps, not everybody wants to write about it. And we do a lot of things that we like, but not everybody will want to write a book about it, despite the fact that I'm also an author. All these years, I've been trying to write actually about my 3 years of life in Alabama when I first came, from Beijing after college, landed in, of all places, in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and I want to write something about those 3 years. And so for a while, but that book, that memoir, tentatively entitled Yellow Alabama, was not going anywhere. And there was something that kind of stopped me from, going forward. And that was when I thought about, Charlie Chan, that may be a good topic to write about because, why? To me, Charlie Chan really holds the key to American culture in a sense, especially from my perspective as, because he's this kind of iconic Chinaman. So for me, another kind of Chinaman, a real Chinaman coming from China, to understand my own experience in America, somehow I have to go through, it's Charlie Chan, the history of Chinese in America first, and who is a better representation, a representative in a sense, than Charlie Chan or Chang Apana, the real Charlie Chan. So the both real and the fictional, together like Siamese twins, they give me, kind of the key to this house without a key, to quote the Charlie Chan novel.
First novel. And so Charlie Chan was then an important part of your whole project of coming to understand American culture. And I guess how big a part was he in your development of the understanding of American culture that you have?
Charlie Chan? Mm-hmm. Well, if the book, for instance, is in a sense, it's a history of Chinese in America, right? And therefore, I keep using the word Chinaman, and this is a good, indication to the extent that I try to track down the etymology of the word, which started out as a neutral term. If you just think about it, you can call somebody Frenchman or Irishman or whatever, Englishman. Why Chinaman is an older man, it became a derogative term. It was because of the anti-Chinese sentiments that gained currency in the middle of 19th century, after the gold rush, and to turn negative. And which led to the 1882 anti-Chinese immigration bill. And then the funny character, Charlie Chan, was born in 1920s, moving on, post-war era, and then the civil rights movement in the 60s and 70s and Asian American protests, etc., etc. So through the eyes of Charlie Chan, you can really see, what's going on with racism or the question of race in America.
I see what you mean with that. And that's a complicated issue to approach as well as an outsider, isn't it? To get the race in America. I mean, it's daunting to even think about when you're a new arrival in this country, I would imagine.
Right. Yes. And it's fascinating too, really.
Now, as far as finding the real Charlie Chan, the inspiration Chang Apana, at what point did you come across his name and realize you had to sort of follow his path as well?
Well, from the Charlie Chan novels that I first discovered in Buffalo, I went on to do more research on Earl de Biggers. And through Biggers, after Buffalo, I first started out teaching at Harvard, and Biggers went to Harvard, for his undergraduate. Through him, I was astonished to discover that there was a real Charlie Chan, because Biggers met up with Chang Apana later on, after he had published a few novels. And their meeting, which is kind of staged, as I describe in the book, but also Chang Apana's meeting with the fictional Charlie Chan, namely Warner Oland, all these kind of strange meetings between the real and the fictional, it's really fascinating. Yeah.
It's certainly the kind of thing that a literary scholar can find very rich indeed, I would imagine.
Absolutely, yes.
And you mentioned in the book as well that you do a lot of traveling to, for example, you have a photograph of Chang Apana's house. Is that the actual structure he lived in?
Yes.
Wow,
yes.
It's got the satellite dishes now I see on it.
Yeah,
but
absolutely. I know. Yes.
It's the very one. And how much did this require of you actually physically going to the places that are involved in the story of Charlie Chan?
Well, I'm a literary scholar and a writer, and I'm always interested in so-called material traces. I'm interested in history. And so it is very important for me to get there, to be there, just to take a look, even if I can't find really anything interesting, but to be there means a great deal to me. And so I flew all the way to Honolulu twice. But of course, my colleagues or friends said, "Do you really have to do research in Hawaii?" And I said, "Yeah, actually, I have to." In fact, I spend those few trips. I spend most of the time reading in the library to look in the archive. And I went to the Honolulu Police Department Museum, which the museum has two basically big legacies. And it's a good moment to talk about this, because one legacy is Chang Apana and the fictional Charlie Chan, and the other is Hawaii 5-0.
Oh, yes. Which you mentioned in the book. Yeah.
Exactly, yes. And
were you a fan of that show as well?
Oh, yes, yes. Not such a big fan of the new series.
Oh, there's a new one. There's a new one.
Yeah, CBS has been, there's a new one coming. It's been on on TV, and I watched a few episodes. And I'm still not sold on the new series.
You do find some strange connections, it seems like, between Hawaii 5-0 and Charlie Chan. Besides even the Hawaii setting, It's, I guess, a way to think about this book, because you of course include a lot of various cultural references that go pretty far and wide, and you travel for the research in the book. And my point is there's a lot more in here than about Charlie Chan directly. It gives you a lot of information around Charlie Chan. And how did that develop in your mind as the way to do this book?
This has something to do with the fact that I'm a poet. I look at reality or imagination in a somewhat fragmented way, because I look at things in snapshots. And history is a great place for, to have those snapshots. And therefore, to understand, the story of Chang Apana, it's impossible, not to revisit the history of Hawaii and how the Chinese came to work on sugarcane plantations. And that's how, because that's what brought Chang Apana's father, to Hawaii, and that was where Apana was born. Or to give you another example, despite, Apana was also a witness to this infamous case called the Massey case in Hawaii in 1931, when, a white woman claimed that she was, gang raped by 6, local boys, which is, that was really the trial, O.J. Simpson trial of, that 60 years earlier, which brought the famous lawyer Clarence Darrow to Hawaii to defend Grace Fortescue, who was the mother of this young woman. And Grace Fortescue, with the help of 3 other, people, kind of murdered one of the 6 colored boys, and so the whole issue and the famous car chase took place in front of Chang Apana's house in Kaimuki, and so he was a witness to this. So in order to understand the full color of this character, but also, the kind of racism going on, it's impossible for me just to limit the book to, a Charlie Chang story. And that's why there's not a single kind of straightforward, a clear-cut Charlie Chang story to tell. There are many facets and strands.
If you've just tuned in, this is the Marketplace of Ideas. I'm Colin Marshall, and my guest is Yunte Huang, poet, scholar of Charlie Chan, and professor of English at the University of California, Santa Barbara. If you want to hear the show again, or if you want to hear any other interview in the Marketplace of Ideas archive, visit colinmarshallradio.com, the official Marketplace of Ideas website. That's colinmarshallradio.com. Have any feedback, questions, comments, or guest suggestions? Don't hesitate to send those along to Colin, C-O-L-I-N, at colinmarshallradio.com. That's Colin at colinmarshallradio.com. And yes, that is me. Now back to the conversation with Yunte Huang on the Marketplace of Ideas, cultural conversation at the depth you demand. I imagine that when you started the research for this book, well, let me ask you this. When did you know there was a whole big book on Charlie Chan in this? I imagine perhaps it seemed like, well, there could be a small sort of thing on him, but then it got wider and more expansive as all these characters from history like Clarence Darrow got involved.
Right.
You had to realize this is a big story, and I could talk as much about this as I want.
Sure. Yes. Well, again, this is I guess as a scholar, as a writer, all you have to do is to dig deep. As Herman Melville would say, writers are like, deep divers. They go down deep and come up, with red eyes, because of the pressure of the depth. And so, for instance, to give you an example, I didn't know until I drove to, I flew to Indiana, Bloomington, Indiana, to work on E.D. Bigger's papers, his correspondence and letters and publication records are all housed in the Lillis Library in Indiana. I flew there and I planned a field trip to Warren, Ohio, via, Canton and Akron, etc., all these kind of Ohio towns. And then I realized, oh man, Clarence Darrow was also born there too. So you found the kind of, you find strange connections. And so those are like, the lucky finds for a writer who's willing to do a lot of research, I guess. You can only go, you can try your best, and sometimes you get lucky and sometimes you don't.
I want to ask a little bit more about the sort of the memoir that began, that maybe transformed into this project, or that you drew from to build this project, because of course Charlie Chan, your book, has a lot of personal, well, a lot is maybe overstating it, but it has a good amount of personal narrative in there of your own. And I want to get a sense of what the build up in your mind was to this original memoir. Is called Yellow Alabama.
Yes. Yeah.
What did you want to say in that you ended up repurposing for this book? Well,
first of all, for instance, it would have been a very different book if, say, a non-Asian or non-Chinese, film historian had written a book about Charlie Chan, this character. Right. It would have been a completely different book. Exactly because my, perspective, my views of this character is really inseparable from my own experience in America. To give you an example, when I left Tuscaloosa in the summer of 1994, I drove this kind of my beat up Toyota hatchback, with, loads of books and a few shirts on my back, and all the way to Buffalo. On the way, somewhere in Ohio, I first saw this sign, Canton.
Right.
Or as I would prefer to pronounce it, Canton, because it was a Chinese city, Guangzhou, but at the time was Canton. But here in the United States, we pronounce it as a Canton. When I saw the sign, I thought, wow, am I dreaming or am I back in China again? And so, and it turns out at that time I had no idea that many years later I'll write a book about, a character who was created by Earl Biggers, who was growing up in that, neck of woods at the time. So these are strange connections and it's impossible for me to omit or to skip these kind of experiences, personal experiences, with the deep history of this character.
And I have to ask about, you mentioned this in the book, how much of a stark change it was for you, but going from China to going to Tuscaloosa,
right.
Alabama, obviously anybody can imagine the difference, when you go from Peking University and
right.
you go to a town that a lot of Americans haven't even been to.
Right.
What did you draw from that experience? that's of course a huge question, but what are the kinds of things you drew from that experience?
Well, first of all, I feel really lucky that I lived there for 3 years, because as some of my friends would say, like, Yunte, you really came to America through the back door. Had I landed right away in New York City or San Francisco, big cities, I would not have been able maybe to have a deeper appreciation of American history or American culture. Because, in the South, if you go to Thanksgiving dinners, you still hear people, speaking in a very angry way about the damn Yankees, and it's not just people in Boston who will say damn Yankees, but also in the South. So that's some perspective. And I'm genuinely fond of my experience and also the Deep South because the history there is so deep. It takes us back, to the very, founding of America, but also Native American, traditions there, the traces and everything. So overall then, I always cherish that experience. And so for me to write about American culture, I have to somehow, situate myself in that kind of, environment. So in a way, to answer your question, Alabama did have a huge impact on me.
And as well, this is just a guess, but in Tuscaloosa, you couldn't simply set yourself up in the nearest Chinatown because I imagine they did not have a Chinatown in Tuscaloosa.
Well, I created my own Chinatown, just opening up my little Chinese restaurant. Yes.
And what was it like to run a Chinese restaurant at that time and in that place?
Well, that's why I really want to write that memoir because that's such a strange, but also, I should say, exciting experience. I felt I was stuck there somehow. And after Beijing, suddenly I landed, in Tuscaloosa. The place, the town is really great. People are very friendly. But I was literally working my butt off as a, restaurateur. I had to cook. I had to do the taxes. I had to manage the place. And, I did everything, delivering food, driving all over town. And it's a great experience for a writer. Because, you draw upon those experiences. So I feel, fortunate to have, lived there.
And I'll draw this parallel. People talk about Charlie Chan and they say, he's an American version of a Chinese man from a certain era. Mm-hmm. And, this is something people say a lot. You write in the book about going to a Chinese buffet. Mm-hmm. Was it when you were visiting Ohio?
Yes.
And people say about Chinese food in America, it's a version of Chinese food that Americans have, in a sense, imagined as well.
Right.
Now, I don't know what you were serving at the place you opened, but is this an accurate parallel to draw between Charlie Chan and American Chinese food, that they're a version of the thing, but not necessarily the thing itself?
Yeah. There's no doubt that Charlie Chan is a made in the USA product. And that's the point I want to make. If you think Charlie Chan is Chinese, you're completely wrong because he's as American as Jack Kerouac. That's the, parallelism I was trying to draw. Kerouac, if you think he's American, he's actually Canadian, French Canadian, somehow who transformed himself into an American, beatnik guru. And so that's why I say, Charlie Chan, including food, this made in America, this kind of cultural hybridization is the cultural transfusion which uniquely defines America.
And I want to get more of your personal sense on this because we mentioned earlier, I asked you, as someone born in China, educated in China, how do you feel about Charlie Chan? But you also described, as we just mentioned, eating the buffet in Ohio.
Right.
And it's a rare perspective. I mean, to these American versions of Chinese things, but then again, you come at it from a Chinese perspective. I can see how it's fascinating, but I want to know even more about sort of what it's like when you're from the real place.
Let me put it this way. When I go to Chinese restaurants here in the United States, or including that little, place in Ohio or my own place in Tuscaloosa, I feel I'm eating Chinese food, but I'm really eating Chinese food at home. I'm just eating food. If you know what I mean.
Yes.
Because in America, we call this Italian food or Chinese food, Indian food,
right.
Where back in those countries, people say we eat food.
Yeah,
exactly.
It's just food. That's a good way to put it. And I want to ask, I'll open a helpful section of the book here is at the end, you have a list of Charlie Chan's aphorisms. Right. And I guess, is this a complete list? Is this
what he
says?
There are hundreds of them.
Yeah.
I could only afford 50.
These are favorites?
About 50. No, these are favorites, but I should also tell you, this has a little bit more over, a little bit over 50 Charlie Chanisms in the back. These are really $20 a laugh. There's a price tag on this because when I first approached 20th Century Fox for permissions to quote, I was trying to quote from the screenplays, right. Not realizing these one-liner fortune cookies Chinese aphorisms are also considered screenplays.
Oh.
I thought they were free. And until they told me, oh, no, you need permissions for these even single line, one-liners too. And so I asked, how much are they? And they said, for each instance of the quote, remember, this is just like one sentence, right. Fortune cookie sayings. They said, we charge $250. Are you crazy?
Wow.
I said, as Chinese, I'm actually happy because, at least it means bodes well for Oriental wisdom. And these are just like cases of faux, fortune cookie wisdoms. Until you, have to buy the real wisdom, those will be expensive. But on the other hand, I can't afford that. And so we negotiated the price down to $1,000 for a bag of 50.
Oh,
and
choose.
That's why, so I went for the really, of course, my favorites and what I thought to be the best in Charlie Chan, aphorism.
I think we can say these on the air without paying anybody anything else. So a few of these examples for actions speak louder than French. Biggest mistakes in history made by people who didn't think. Facts like photographic film must be exposed before developing. And these are sayings that are also rendered in Charlie Chan's distinctive English. Mm-hmm. And that has become, I think, the most talked about element of the caricature is that he speaks in this way, in this right. imperfect English. And this is something I want to get your perspective on as well, because as someone who came to America, mastered English, and has, beaten many English speakers at their own game, you're a professor of English now. What do you think about the way Charlie Chan talks, his sort of linguistic idiosyncrasies? Well,
I should say, in a word, it's very poetic. Because it's funny and poetic, for him to say, that's the difference between, say, if you like the detective genre, you can think about Hercule Poirot. He's another funny character. Or Lieutenant Columbo, for instance. I'm comparing really, their manners of speech, how they talk, right? Mm. Hercule Poirot will speak English, and he will use a lot of proverbs as well. But he usually uses really cliched real English proverbs.
Right.
And Lieutenant Columbo, who will just mumble jumble, playing dumb. And there's something Charlie Chanish about Lieutenant Columbo is that he plays dumb. And, of course, it's different from, the way, Charlie Chan dresses, because Charlie Chan is meticulous, more like a Hercule Poirot. Right. And Lieutenant Columbo will talk about his wife, who doesn't really exist, but he's just his way of getting you, the suspect, off guard. To back to the manner of speaking then, that kind of, broken or pidgin English, offended a lot of people in the sense that they think it's a mockery of non-native speakers. On the other hand, I find it to be very poetic in a sense. If you look at, say, imagism, once again, go back to Ezra Pound, or Amy Lowell, or these American poets, if you think, these poets also do this kind of linguistic mimicry to imitate, including T.S. Eliot or Gertrude Stein. All these major American poets actually benefited from, studying the foreign languages and incorporate these kind of poetic and linguistic elements into their work. So if you think it that way, this kind of pidgin or, linguistic mimicry becomes very poetic and, fascinating.
There's a story that I forget if you mentioned it in the book or not, but elsewhere you do as well, tuning into the Voice of America broadcast as a kid and surreptitiously memorizing English that way.
Right.
What fascinates you about the English language?
Well, the language is fascinating itself because it's different from the language I grew up in. Anyway, I was 11 at the time. When I was playing one day, I was playing with a transistor radio, in a small town where I grew up. And, transistor radio is something that almost every household owned at the time in China. And that's like our TV because there was no TV. And with that transistor radio, you can basically tap into many radio stations in the world. It's like satellite dish today. And so that night I was playing with it. And then suddenly, I came to this channel where, there was the Voice of America, a special English, so-called, because it's English spoken at a lower pace, about 2/3 of the pace. And I was fascinated. I was hooked, just the same way I was hooked by the Charlie Chang novels. And that's how I guess my English became better than my peers because of the secret. And it was a dangerous thing to do because, listening to so-called foreign radios was illegal at the time, and I could have sent my parents to jail.
No, really, there was a real danger of punishment there.
Oh, absolutely. This is a politically kind of subversive, thing about today. Nobel Prize, peace, that whole, controversy over that. But to close the, to put an end to this, put a nice end to this, when I go back to Ithaca, next week, the Voice of America is actually going to make a film. They send out a journalist and a photographer and a film, with a camera. They want to produce kind of a film, a documentary about, the book, but also my experience of learning English from Voice of America. So what goes around comes around, I guess. Yeah.
And your fascination has been enough with English so that you've, literally become a poet and become a professor of English. I mean, this is well beyond people who are born in China and they think, hey, I want to learn English, and then they proceed to master it. You've gone the next level up and are, proceeding to be creative with it. I want to get more of a sense of what, of course, the language, as you said, is different from the one you grew up with, and thus it's interesting. But what else do you find, useful about English, or what are the possibilities of English that you particularly enjoy?
Well, it's less about the language itself, but it's really about culture. English happens to be the dominant language in the United States. So for me, to come to America and, get a degree in the language, literature, and being able to teach here, it's about the charm and the attraction of the language, but it's also about the cultural structure. You can't really imagine of, an American going to China, learning the language, and I'm not really speaking ill Chinese culture or anything. It's just a fact that in terms of openness of a society, and that's why this is we have a great country here, democracy, a culture that is really kind of open to immigration. Of course, there are periods, right? 1920s and it's now today. So I think Charlie Chang is a good kind of topic for today, especially to remind people, like, if you ask me, this question, so my advice or the lesson I learned from my own experience is that, don't, throw away what's so great about America, which is the openness, toward the other. To allow others to come in. And I really use myself and as an example. I can't imagine now, maybe 50 years from now, an American can go to China, learn Chinese, become a professor at Peking University. It can be done maybe 50 years later, but not now. It speaks less, I think, to the language itself, but more about the culture.
When you were growing up in China, listening to these broadcasts and so on until you came over here, what was your image of America? What was the America in your mind at that time?
Well, just imagine my shock when I was looking for Times Square in Tuscaloosa.
You had pictured, say, New York City as that had
Absolutely.
been.
I was looking for Times Square in Tuscaloosa.
Is that a common contrast for people who come over and don't go to major cities in America, that they have in their mind that, okay, this is what America is, which is formed by a lot of the images that come over, which are taken from places like Times Square.
Right.
Is this a common thing to have to come and readjust to, oh, okay, there's lots of different Americas here?
Oh, absolutely. And there are a lot of, stories and books about that kind of new immigrants. There's an old immigrant literature, which is about Chinatown, arriving in Angel Island, et cetera, but there are also, literature of new immigrants, including, Indian immigrants like Bharati Mukherjee, write about, or, a student arriving in Midwest,
right.
et cetera. So, and I'm really part of that kind of new FOBs, fresh off boats, except we walk off, Boeing.
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
That's an easier trip.
Yeah.
Since the book has been out for a bit now, and there's been a lot of reactions to it, of course, in the press and otherwise, and you've had discussions about it yourself in the media, what have been your impressions of how the book has been, I guess, with the conversation that has gone on around the book, how the buzz, maybe they'll say, or just the way people are maybe revisiting Charlie Chan because of your book, or rethinking about Charlie Chan, or are they rethinking, or is it just bringing back older thoughts about Charlie Chan? What's going on with the way people have received it?
Well, it's really a bag of a great variety in terms of response. I got a lot of emails, and that's the disadvantage of being in the public, that I'm teaching a public university. They can always find you your email address for them.
They just send straight to you.
Yeah, I'm not, that's okay, because, I'm not such a private person. Having grown up in China, you have a different, conceptualization of privacy,
Yes, I see.
But anyway, I'm very pleased and, flattered, receiving all these so-called fan mails. And these are really mixed, most of them are really, very favorable, enthusiastic, thank you for bringing this character back. And some, readers are even more knowledgeable about, their kind of they want to share with me their personal experience with this character and the novels. And some of them have personal connections to some of the actors or writers who are involved in the making of Charlie Chan. And there's some criticism too, would say, how can you bring this character back to life after we try so hard to kill him, really?
Yes.
And so I think, I'm open to all these kind of, different views, because like I said, the main mission with this book is really for me to try to reopen this discussion over race and culture in America.
It's not possible to kill a fictional character, is it?
Well, there's a term called the disappear someone Soviet style.
Oh, I see. Yes. But a fictional character can always come back, can't they? There's nothing to
They
really
can come
destroy.
back, sure. They can come back, but they can disappear for a long time.
I see. It takes a book like this to maybe bring the character back out again?
I hope so. Yes. I do think he's back. Yes.
There's a poem here at the end as well that I wanted to ask about, and this is from your other book, Cribs, as well, right?
Yes,
the poem you include here?
Right.
And I want to get a sense of, you mentioned that there's a connection here to Charlie Chan's own linguistic sense. What is that connection?
It's the sense of, you're talking about my a collection of poems published in Hawaii, really, quite appropriately entitled Cribs. And the cribs, as you know, is not just the children's bed, but also, the middle area, intermediate kind of aerial translation, means a literal translation. And so with this poem, for instance, what I call, think haiku, act loku, in the sense of, playing on this word haiku and a low, high and low, is that what I'm interested in is that, Charlie Chan is a case of cultural translation, right? For older biggers or Hollywood kind of reconceptualized Chinese, right? And here in the poem, in these poems or in this particular one, I'm trying to conceptualize, this kind of linguistic translation or back translation. So if I say, take it with a grain of MSG, to me, that sounds like Charlie Chang in the sense that he takes, for instance, one of Charlie Chang's sayings is, looking for needle in haystack is the only sensible location.
Right.
Right. I mean, we are familiar with the cliche, looking for needle in haystack usually means, in a negative sense, it's a waste of time. It's difficult. But he, turns it around and saying like, well, actually haystack is the only sensible location. If you are looking for needle, then this is actually wise to look for needle in haystack. So in that sense, it's a play on cliches. And what I'm doing this Cribs, this collection of poems, is to do this kind of cultural translation, but also linguistic, to look at American idioms and ways of saying, from the Chinese perspective, because I'm Chinese, and
you describe what you've just said about the way that Charlie Chan puts a new perspective to a lot of these old cliches, and how you can examine Charlie Chan and see, you can get a new perspective on ideas or concepts that people might have thought were put away at the end of the era that conceived Charlie Chan. Mm-hmm. It sounds like, and correct me if I'm wrong or if this sounds too grand, but a lot of your interests do revolve around getting a new perspective on something old.
Less so than say, I'm more interested in what happens when two cultures meet. East and West, Chinese or American meet. And so I'm interested in this kind of encounter. And that's why I said, the book fortunately is published in a critical moment, I think, when China and U.S. relationship is changing. And to give you an example, how I look at these kind of encounters, from the perspective of both a cultural historian, but also a poet. For instance, when Richard Nixon went to China in 1972, he brought along Forrest Gump, right? To play ping pong diplomacy.
So the movie would have.
Exactly. But anyway, when he was in China, his Chinese host took him to see, the Chinese Great Wall, right? When Nixon got to the Great Wall, he said, "Wow, what a great wall." I guess that broke the ice of Chinese and the U.S. relationship, because he flattered Chinese by renaming it "What a Great Wall," because the thing was called the Great Wall in the first place. So I'm looking at as a poet, like linguistic accidents, how interesting they are. So I'm really describing, less interested in like resuscitating old material, but really to look at this, crucial, critical encounters from a more nuanced or new perspective. Yeah.
And before we finish this, I do want to get an idea of, you mentioned a few times the always changing, I guess, but the currently not the best moment in U.S.-Chinese relations that there has ever been. And with the perspective you have, I mean, how do you view this increasing anxiety on the United States' part about China? Because, I mean, you hear so much of it whether you want to or not, Right.
Yeah, because maybe there's a good place to tell you this as well. For instance, when I was looking for a Chinese publisher for the Chinese edition or translation, they are very interested because of the the attention the book is getting in the United States, and the Chinese media is actually more interested in the fact the book is getting attention in the United States. So they're reporting on the reporting of the book in a sense, and but as for the publishers, for instance, one editor said in the middle of our conversation, he said, Charlie Chang is good, but actually, we are more interested in Fu Manchu right now. And that really speaks volume to the Chinese mentality. And that's why it's important to look at this character again, because like you said, it's a critical moment in some sense. If the relationship goes sour, then it becomes very dangerous in a sense. So it's kind of crucial for us to re-understand and look at Chinese in America and understand what happened in the past and see, where else, how we can go forward.
Now, the Chinese publishers really like this evil, bizarre Chinese villain more than this sort of lovable, smart Chinese hero.
Well, if you look at, that's why I said it's kind of dangerous or testy. if they do feel that way, they would prefer an evil Chinaman. Because about Fu Manchu, Charlie Chang is very polite. He's not a threat. Fu Manchu is a threat, yes. Despite the fact he's devilish. At least he's powerful. If Chinese, think that way, then as you see, it becomes quite dangerous. And I just got off, this. My editor just sent me this review. It's going to be published in Irish Times in England, in UK. But I'm just going to read one sentence. And actually, that was the last sentence of this review. I take it with a grain of MSG. Once again, it says, "Here is an entertaining book that may help to avert World War III."
That's maybe the best line I've heard in all of the reviews.
So, yeah.
It may avert World War III. That book, by the way, is Charlie Chan, The Untold Story of the Honorable Detective and His Rendezvous with American History. Yunte Huang, thanks so much for taking the time today.
Thank you, Colin.
This has been the Marketplace of Ideas. I've been Colin Marshall. If you have any questions, comments, guest suggestions, whatever, don't hesitate to send that along to Colin, Colin, at colinmarshallradio.com. That is Colin at colinmarshallradio.com. If you'd like to hear this program again or any other interview in the Marketplace of Ideas archive, go ahead and visit colinmarshallradio.com, the official website of the Marketplace of Ideas. It's colinmarshallradio.com. And don't forget, the website of Ben Althouse, the man who made our theme music, is available at benalthouse.com. As always, thank you for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time on the Marketplace of Ideas, cultural conversation at the depth you demand.